This is a presentation on the Roman Assemblies. I'm going to focus on two. There is no skinny for this presentation, so please take notes as we go. I'll explain later. The Roman Assemblies were chambers where decisions could be made by the Roman people. And originally they were the lawmaking chambers of the Roman Republic before it was sort of subsumed by the Senate, or the Senate became the de facto governing chamber. It's not like the ecclesia. Those of you who maybe did National 5 Classics last year, or maybe you already have a background knowledge in Greek politics, the Athenian ecclesia was far more democratic in the sense that one person could turn up at Pnyx Hill and be involved in discussions and vote individually. Every man mattered in that sense. It was a pure democracy. There were 4 Roman assemblies, and they each have a slightly different, or rather intricate, shall we say, more complex system of voting. Please pay close attention because this stuff is complex. So, the assemblies used group voting, which meant that the citizens, say it's 1,000 citizens, they are divided into groups of, say, 50. And each group has a vote within itself, and that group comes back with one vote. The demonstration on the slide is that if you had 1,000 members, 501 vote in favour of a premise, 499 vote against, then that group of 1,000 would return a group vote of 1 in favour. So far so good? I think so. Then the group votes were tallied up, and a majority would either approve or disapprove what was being voted. Now, this method of group voting meant that the wealthy, the elite, were allowed to have a disproportionate influence on decision-making in Rome. Let's look at the Centuriate Assembly. In Roman history, you will remember that citizens were also soldiers. They put down the plough, they picked up the sword. The cliche I'm getting tired of saying myself. But the armed forces, the military of Rome, as you will know, would have subsections, including centuries. And some of you will be going, oh, that's where the word centurion comes from. Yes, he was the guy in charge of this subdivision of the Roman army. So citizens were also soldiers. And originally, when it came to voting, they would gather together in their military divisions, their centuries, hence the Century Assembly. As time went on, fewer and fewer citizens were also soldiers, but possibly for reasons of tradition or romance, the name remained the Centuriate Assembly. This assembly was responsible for voting for the positions of highest prestige, dignitas, if you remember that concept, and power in Rome, imperium. There were 193 assemblies in the Centuriate Assembly, so 193 centuries. And you would think that that would mean 193 times 100 citizens. And you would be wrong. A citizen was assigned to a particular century according to the property they owned, how much property they owned, how much money they had. Now, yes, I've even had to go to the extent of providing a diagram for this. There were more centuries for the wealthiest people in Roman society than the poor. The majority of Rome's poorest citizens were put in one century. So that century would have had thousands of people in it. Hardly democracy. And the few hundred of men at the top of Roman society, the elite, the aristocracy, they were split between 70 small assemblies. And this gave the wealthy a massively disproportionate amount of power. If you have a look at the illustration here, in the century on the right, to achieve a majority and to get that vote, for the group vote, you need to persuade 3 men. In the one on the left, to achieve the group vote, you clearly need to persuade many, many more. And this is how the structure was. We'll come on to the number of centuries in a moment, but this is the fundamental, to my mind, to my way of thinking. It allowed a disproportionate amount of power to rest in the hands of the wealthiest. The rich were, as the slide says, numerically fewer, but had more voting units. Okay. In other clips, I've mentioned the equites, sometimes translated as the knights, but more useful to consider as the business class. The business class had 18 centuries, 18 voting groups. There were 70 for that elite class. Combined, that's 88. Now, there were only 193 centuries in total. So, if the equites and the upper class voted together, that would mean that they only needed to achieve 9 of the poor assemblies to pass whatever legislation was in front of them. As soon as the majority number of 97 was reached, voting stopped. In addition to that, the wealthiest centuries voted first, so that by the time the poor actually get the chance to vote, and they didn't always get that, by the time they got the chance to vote, there could be an enormous groundswell, or it would seem that there was a huge majority voting in a particular direction. Now, the 88 elite, shall we say, centuries, yes, they could be split, and occasionally on some issues they were, especially in the 1st century BCE, when the powers of the assemblies and general social cohesion started to crack at the edges. And of course, to achieve that 88, that near majority, that did depend on everybody in the upper echelons in those elite voting centuries to agree. And in our period, the 1st century BCE, that definitely wasn't something you could take for granted. But in principle, it was much, much easier for the wealthy to get the people's assemblies to do what they want. Let's have a look at the tribal assembly now. Rather than dividing Roman society by these centuries, these military divisions, this was something, I guess, something a little bit more recognizable as constituencies in the modern age. Different parts of Italy had a tribe, and that tribe had a group vote, so it was another group voting system. The tribal assembly elected the people's tribunes, other tribunes, and lesser magistrates. There were 35 tribes. Once 18 had been reached, that was the end of voting. Traditionally, voting took place by lot, so it was seemingly at random, but by the 1st century BCE, most of the tribes voted at the same time. So, organised by geographic districts, but it was also dominated by the rich. 4 of these districts were in the city of Rome, where most of the poor people in Italy lived. Remember, in our period, everybody gravitates towards the city as fewer people worked on farms, lots of people lost their property. So that means that 31 of these tribes are outside Rome, less populated areas. Who lives in less populated areas? Well, people who can afford to live there. Most of Rome's wealthy elite would have had estates outside Rome. So you can start to see how this prejudices things in favour of the elite. But on top of that, in order to vote, you had to go to Rome. And most poor people in these rather more far-flung areas, they can't afford to take time off work. They can't afford to travel to Rome to vote. So who does go? Well, the people who do have time to take off work, or maybe don't work at all. And people who do have the money and resources to travel. And consequently, these 31, slightly further out from Rome tribes, they tend to be filled with Rome's wealthier people. From time to time, there would be some legislation, such as where the reforms of the Gracchi brothers. Look it up, Gracchi. They proposed legislation which would benefit the poorest in Italy. And on those occasions, the poor actually mobilized, and they did travel to Rome in large numbers. But it was a very infrequent thing. But that sort of thing was a reminder to the elite that you couldn't ignore the poor completely. Pretty much most of the time you could, and did, but not always. So what are the problems with Roman democracy? Well, you had to be in Rome to vote, which shut out pretty much anyone who was poor outside the city of Rome. Democracy in speech marks. I've interchangeably used the word republican democracy throughout these clips, and I mean it's a convenient shorthand, but it's not accurate. Democracy in the Athenian sense, literally was ruled by the people, in that every single person would go to the ecclesia. I'm not going to get into the complications of that statement, but it really was individuals taking part. In the Republic, it was less so. Anyway, wealthy citizens could take time off work and travel. The Centuriate Assembly transparently advantaged the wealthy. In the tribal assembly, there were only 4 tribes which could genuinely speak for the poorest citizens. Citizens who had lived outside Rome and moved into Rome, they actually kept their registration with their original tribe. So they could vote for a tribe outside Rome while they were living there. But obviously we're not talking about huge numbers for this. But it's recorded, that happened. There were a very limited number of meetings of the tribal assembly especially, and these meetings tended just to be to elect magistrates. A magistrate could convene a meeting, but even if a magistrate was moved, perhaps a citizen speaks to the magistrate, wants an issue to be addressed, that magistrate then calls the assembly together, but then the magistrate chooses who gets to speak. So even if you manage to get an issue onto a discussion, there's no guarantee that you would be allowed as a citizen to speak or to give your side of the story. For the tribal assembly, voters walked up a pontes, which is it was like a bridge structure. And at the top, they threw a tablet marked with a yes or a no, or with the name of the candidate they're voting for, into a large urn, and that's how the votes were counted. And lastly, before I finish with this, do not underestimate especially in the 1st century BCE. The physical intimidation and the violence that could be used in and around the people's assemblies. If a wealthy man could afford to employ thugs to beat up voters, to, in some cases, kill individuals, or in any way to manipulate the assembly, it happened. Especially in the 1st century BC, when cohesion in the Republic is falling apart. You've got the rise of these strong individuals, these generals such as Julius Caesar, people trying to get around the Senate, people trying to manipulate the people's assemblies. Violence was an issue. So much as on the surface it's a sort of democracy, yeah, is it though? Right. There's no skinny for this presentation because it's too long and it's too detailed, and you would never be able to fit it into a single slide. I hope you've been taking notes all the way through this, because in the exam, yes, you will be called on those little details. The numbers, we expect you to know them. So if you're still trying to think, how many centuries were there? How many tribes were there? What was a majority? Go back and learn them, because you're going to be tested in class, that's for sure, and it will come up in the exam. If you have any questions, as usual, see me in class via Twitter, via email, via any other form of communication short of banging on my front door. Thank you.